Working the night shift at a motel might not be glamorous, but right now, I really need the job. When I stumbled across a listing for a desk clerk position at a small roadside motel just off the interstate, I figured it was the kind of quiet, no-frills job I needed. Who checks into a motel at 2 a.m. in the middle of nowhere anyway? I pictured long stretches of silence, sipping bad coffee, and maybe reading a book or two to pass the time. Easy money, right? The motel itself was exactly what you'd expect. A faded neon sign that buzzed and flickered, paint peeling off its stucco walls, and a parking lot where weeds sprouted defiantly between the cracks. It looked like the kind of place you'd pass without a second thought, a relic from another era when road trips were still a novelty. Inside, the air was thick and smelled faintly of mildew, with a dash of industrial cleaner. A small bell on the counter jangled as I walked in, and a wiry man shuffled out from a back room. He was older, mid-60s maybe, with sunken eyes and a face that looked like it had seen too many sleepless nights. His name tag read Mr. Carver, though the name felt almost too formal for someone who gave off the vibe of a worn-out gas station attendant. "You're here about the job?" he asked, squinting at me like he wasn't sure if I was real. "Yes, sir," I said, trying to sound confident. Good, he muttered, nodding. "We need someone. Haven't had a steady night clerk in a while." I was about to ask what he meant by that, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. "You worked nights before?" "Yeah," I lied. I didn't think a summer gig at an all-night diner during college counted, but he didn't seem to care. "Good enough," he said, tapping a cigarette against the counter before thinking better of it and tucking it back into his pocket. "Look, this place ain't busy. Most nights, you'll be lucky if 2, maybe 3 people check in. Your job's simple. Keep the desk manned, answer the phones, lock up when the shift's over. That's it." It sounded almost too good to be true. "And that's it?" I asked. "Well," he trailed off, hesitating. His eyes darted to the lobby window, where the blinds hung half-closed, casting thin slats of moonlight across the floor. "There are a few other things, not exactly part of the job description, but important all the same." He ducked behind the counter and rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a folded piece of paper. When he handed it to me, his fingers lingered a second too long, like he was reluctant to let it go. "Read this before your shift," he said. I opened the paper and frowned. It wasn't a training guide or an employee handbook. It was a list of oddly specific instructions, written in shaky, all-caps handwriting. Rule 1, do not check in guests who arrive after midnight. Rule 2, keep the lobby blinds closed at all times. Rule 3, if the room phone rings, do not answer unless it's room 6. Rule 4, avoid the parking lot between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Rule 5, never leave the front desk unattended. I raised an eyebrow and let out a dry chuckle. "What is this? Is this some kind of initiation thing?" Mr. Carver's expression darkened. "No," he said, his tone dead serious. "Those rules are there for a reason. Follow them and you'll be fine." I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he turned away and started wiping down the counter with a rag that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. "Fine, how exactly?" I pressed. "What happens if?" He snapped. "Just follow the rules." This was the first sign of real emotion breaking through his otherwise monotone demeanor. "And don't go asking questions you don't want answers to." His reaction caught me off guard, and I decided not to push any further. "Okay," I said, tucking the paper into my pocket. Mr. Carver sighed and rubbed his temple. "Shift starts at 9. Be on time, and for God's sake, kid." He looked up, his tired eyes locking with mine. "Don't try to be a hero." With that, he turned and disappeared back into the office, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit lobby. As I walked out into the cool night air, the list felt heavier in my pocket than it had any right to be. I told myself it was just an overworked manager trying to scare the new guy. But deep down, I had a feeling this wasn't about hazing or pranks. It was something else, something I wasn't ready to understand. The lobby felt even smaller at night. Under the harsh, fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum floor and peeling wallpaper gave the place an unsettling, sterile quality. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the silence like a constant reminder of how slowly time was moving. I had shown up 15 minutes early for my shift, determined to make a good impression. Mr. Carver had handed me the keys with a curt nod, mumbled something about catching up on sleep, and disappeared before I could ask any more questions. Now it was just me, the desk, and a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. The first hour or so of my shift passed quietly enough. I flipped through the channels on the motel's ancient TV, trying to find something that wasn't static or infomercials, and half-scrolled through my phone to keep from nodding off. At around 10:30 p.m., the soft jingle of the lobby bell startled me. I looked up to see a man standing at the desk. He was tall and lanky, his hoodie zipped halfway up, exposing a plain white t-shirt underneath. His face was pale, almost too pale, but his features were friendly enough, with a faint, polite smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, hi," I said, standing a little too quickly and nearly bumping my knee against the desk. "Can I help you?" He nodded slowly, his gaze steady but unnervingly calm. "The ice machine isn't working," he said, his voice soft but deliberate, as though every word was carefully chosen. "Oh, yeah," I stammered, fumbling for a response. "Sorry about that. I think it's been down for a while. I can, have someone take a look at it in the morning?" He didn't react right away, just kept his steady gaze locked on me. After a moment, he added, "I'm in room 7. "Oh, right," I said, grabbing a scrap of paper and pretending to jot it down even though I had no idea what to do about the ice machine. "I'll make sure maintenance knows first thing." "Thanks," he said, his smile lingering for just a second longer than it should have. He leaned slightly closer, his movements smooth but unnaturally precise. "You're new, aren't you?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yeah," I said, scratching the back of my neck. "Is it that obvious?" He tilted his head slightly, his smile fading into something more neutral. "You've got that look, like you're still figuring out how things work." I laughed nervously. "Well, it's my first night. I'm just trying not to screw anything up." He nodded again, his expression turning oddly serious. "If you want my advice," he leaned in just a little closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Always follow the rules. It's the only way you'll survive the night." My stomach twisted at his words, the casual tone of our conversation suddenly taking a darker turn. What do you mean by that?" I asked, my voice faltering slightly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he straightened up, his gaze still fixed on me. "Just stick to the rules," he said, his faint smile returning. "You'll be fine." "Yeah, I'll do that," I replied, forcing a weak smile. I watched him walk back toward the hallway that led to the guest rooms. His steps were slow and deliberate, fading into the shadows until he disappeared entirely. The lobby felt eerily quiet once he left. I stared at the door to the guest rooms for a moment, replaying his words in my head. "Always follow the rules. It's the only way you'll survive the night." I sat back down, gripping the edge of the desk as unease settled over me. My mind raced, paranoia creeping in despite my attempts to dismiss it. I told myself he was just trying to mess with the new guy. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I flipped through the TV channels, hoping to find something that wasn't static or an infomercial. After settling on a rerun of an old detective show, I leaned back in the creaky office chair and pulled out my phone. Scrolling through social media kept me occupied for a while, though the occasional creak of the building settling sent shivers down my spine. Every now and then, I glanced at the list of rules tucked under the counter. I hadn't looked at it since Mr. Carver handed it to me, but its presence felt oddly reassuring, like a talisman I didn't understand but didn't dare dismiss. By 12:15 a.m., boredom started to set in. The detective show blurred into background noise, and my eyes drifted to the lobby windows. The blinds were drawn as instructed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond them, watching. Of course, that was ridiculous. There was no one out there. Still, I found myself glancing at the clock more frequently, willing time to move faster. My phone buzzed with a text from a friend asking how the new job was going, and I started to type out a sarcastic reply when the desk bell rang. The sharp sound jolted me upright. My heart thudded as I stared at the small silver bell on the counter, its polished surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For a second, I thought I imagined it, but then the bell rang again, louder this time. I leaned over the counter, craning my neck to see the lobby door. No one was there. My fingers hovered over my phone, debating whether to call Mr. Carver, but then I shook my head. No need to be jumpy on my first night. Maybe it was a breeze or something. I was still convincing myself when I heard it, a faint tapping sound like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the window. The blinds were down, thank God, but the noise was unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my mind racing. Rule 2, keep the blinds closed at all times. I thought about peeking, just a quick look to put my mind at ease, but Mr. Carver's words echoed in my head. Don't try to be a hero. Instead, I grabbed the list from under the counter and held it tightly, as if the crinkled piece of paper could shield me from whatever was outside. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My breathing felt too loud, too deliberate. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I forced myself to take a sip of the terrible coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, the doorbell rang. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was at the door. I swallowed hard and glanced at the clock. 12:30 a.m. Don't check in guests after midnight, the list had said. I stepped closer to the door, careful to keep the counter between me and whatever was on the other side. Hello? I called out, my voice cracking. Nothing but silence. And then a muffled voice, please, let me in. It was a man's voice, low and hoarse, like he'd been running or yelling. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Please, he repeated, his tone desperate. They're coming, you have to let me in. Every instinct screamed at me to open the door. The man sounded terrified, like his life depended on it. But the rules... I glanced down at the list in my hand, the shaky black letters staring back at me like a warning. My heart raced as I took another step closer to the door, torn between compassion and fear. Who's coming? I asked, my voice trembling. There was silence again. And then, faintly, from somewhere far off in the parking lot, I heard it. A sound like low, uneven footsteps dragging across the asphalt. I backed away from the door, clutching the list so tightly it crumpled in my hands. The man outside let out a sharp, panicked gasp. No, 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 no. And then he was gone. No more voice, no more footsteps, just the oppressive silence of the empty lobby and the distant hum of the highway. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, staring at the door as though expecting it to burst open. When I finally sat down, my body felt like it didn't belong to me, numb, tense, and trembling all at once. The clock ticked on, dragging the minutes out painfully. That's when I heard it, the faintest rustle, like fabric brushing against something solid. The blinds at the front desk shifted slightly, the sound cutting through the stillness like a blade. I turned my head sharply, my pulse quickening. The movement was subtle, just enough to catch my eye. I stared at the blinds, my breath catching in my throat. There was no draft, no air conditioning vent nearby. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. For a moment, I debated ignoring it. After all, the list said to keep the blinds closed at all times, not check them. But curiosity gnawed at me. It wasn't like I was opening them, just peeking through the slats. I leaned forward cautiously and lifted one of the blinds with a finger. At first, I didn't see anything. The parking lot was empty, lit by dim overhead lamps that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. A few cars sat scattered across the lot, their windows glinting faintly in the light. Everything seemed still, lifeless. And then I saw it. Near the far edge of the lot, where the lights barely reached, a shadowy figure stood. They were too far away to make out any details, just a tall, motionless silhouette staring directly at the motel. My stomach twisted. I blinked, half expecting the figure to vanish, but it didn't. It just stood there, a dark smudge against the night. I couldn't tell if it was a person, a trick of the light, or something else entirely. Okay, don't panic, I muttered to myself, stepping back from the window. The rules didn't say anything about looking, right? Just to keep the blinds closed. I glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m., 15 minutes until the dreaded 2 a.m. mark, when the list had explicitly warned me to avoid the parking lot. I tried to focus on something else, flipping through the TV channels and scrolling on my phone, but my attention kept drifting back to the blinds. What if the figure moved closer? What if it tried to come inside? By 2 a.m., the tension in my chest was unbearable. I couldn't help myself. I checked the blinds again. The figure was gone. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The parking lot lights flickered, buzzing faintly like they were struggling to stay on. The shadows danced and warped, making the empty space look even more unsettling. I stepped back from the window, swallowing hard. Rule 4 echoed in my mind. Avoid the parking lot between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. I wasn't about to break that one, not after what I'd seen. The lights flickered again, and then everything went still. The parking lot returned to its eerie, silent normalcy, but the tension in the air lingered. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the figure had been a guest from one of the rooms, or some random passerby. Maybe the lights flickering was just old wiring. But then I heard it. Faint footsteps, soft but deliberate, just outside the lobby door. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the door, half expecting it to swing open. The footsteps paused, then resumed, circling the building. Each step sent a fresh wave of dread rippling through me. "Stay inside," I whispered, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the lobby. For a moment there was silence, and then tap, tap, tap. Something was at the glass door. Not knocking exactly, more like testing, as if it wanted to see if the door would open. I clamped my mouth shut, terrified that even breathing too loudly might draw attention. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost playful. I glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. 45 minutes until I'd be free of this nightmare, assuming I could last that long. The tapping stopped. I listened intently, straining to hear any hint of movement, but there was nothing. Just the low hum of the vending machine in the corner and the distant buzz of the parking lot lights. I stayed rooted to the spot, my legs refusing to move. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to investigate. The list hadn't mentioned footsteps or tapping, but I wasn't taking any chances. When the clock struck 2:30, I finally allowed myself a shaky breath. The tapping didn't return, and the parking lot stayed empty. But I knew better than to think the night was over. It had only just begun. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a weighted blanket. I stayed behind the desk, muscles tense, straining to hear anything beyond the faint hum of the vending machine. The footsteps and tapping were gone, but my nerves were far from settled. The phone on the desk rang, its sharp jingle cutting through the quiet like a knife. I jumped, heart slamming against my ribs. The list. Rule 3. If the room phone rings, do not answer unless it's room 6. I glanced at the old rotary phone, its cracked plastic casing vibrating with each shrill ring. The glowing red number on the tiny display above the phone sent a chill down my spine. Room 7. It was him, the man from earlier. The guest in room 7 was calling directly. My hand hovered over the receiver, heart pounding. The list had been specific about room 6, but this wasn't the desk phone. It was the room line. I swallowed hard and picked up the receiver, pressing it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. At first, there was nothing but static, a faint crackling that made my skin crawl. Then a voice came through, low, strained, and barely audible over the interference. "Don't let them in," it whispered. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my hand trembling as I set it back on the cradle. My pulse thundered in my ears as the words echoed in my mind. Don't let them in. The guest in room 7. What were they talking about? Who was them? Before I could make sense of it, the lobby door rattled violently. I froze. The door didn't open, but it shook, as if someone was testing it. My breath caught in my throat as a knock echoed through the room. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I stayed rooted behind the desk, heart pounding. The knocks came again, louder this time. "Hey," a voice called out, distorted and uneven. "You forgot to check me in." The blood drained from my face. It wasn't just the words, it was the way the voice sounded. It was too deep, too hollow, like it was being played back on an old tape recorder. I gripped the edge of the desk, forcing myself to stay still. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The voice answered, still distorted, still wrong. "You didn't check me in." The blinds over the door shifted slightly, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow pass behind them. My stomach twisted as I remembered the figure I'd seen earlier in the parking lot. The knocks grew more insistent, echoing through the empty lobby. I glanced at the clock, 2:40 a.m. 20 minutes until the worst of the night was supposed to be over, but I wasn't sure I could last that long. The voice came again, this time more urgent. "Let me in, I have a reservation." My instincts screamed at me to open the door, to face whatever was out there and end this nightmare. But the list flashed in my mind, and with it, Mr. Carver's warning, "Don't try to be a hero." I backed away from the desk, gripping the crumpled list in my hand like a lifeline. "I can't help you," I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. Silence fell over the lobby, thick and suffocating. For a moment I thought it was over, but then the door rattled again, this time harder, like someone or something was trying to force it open. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The phone on the desk rang again, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet. I didn't answer it. The knocking stopped abruptly, and I heard the faintest sound, a low, guttural chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. And then, as quickly as it started, it was gone. I sank into the office chair, gripping the edge of the desk to steady myself. The lobby was quiet again, but the air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I glanced at the clock, 2:55 a.m. Just 5 more minutes. I told myself I'd make it, but deep down, I knew the night wasn't done with me yet. I grabbed the list of rules with trembling hands, the paper crinkling loudly in the stillness. My eyes scanned the lines, the shaky black ink swimming as I tried to focus. Each rule felt more like a warning now, a desperate plea from someone who had already endured this hell. Do not check in guests who arrive after midnight. Okay, that one's okay. Keep the lobby blinds closed at all times. I glanced at the blinds, slightly shifted from when I peeked earlier. If the room phone rings, do not answer unless it's room 6. I'd broken that one too. Avoid the parking lot between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. I'd stayed inside, but the parking lot itself seemed to have other plans. My stomach twisted as I realized how many rules I'd already bent or outright shattered. I shot to my feet and moved to the blinds, yanking them shut tightly, making sure no cracks remained for whatever was out there to peek through. The knot in my chest tightened as I sat back down, clutching the list like it was my last connection to sanity. The clock ticked, each second dragging out like an eternity. I checked it compulsively. 2:30 a.m. Then the lights outside began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, a faint buzzing sound as the parking lot lamps dimmed and brightened sporadically. But then they pulsed violently, the fluorescent glow cutting through the night in bursts, like the motel was warning me of something I couldn't see. I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the blinds. They stayed shut, but the flickering light outside cast shifting shadows across the room. And then on the CCTV monitor, I saw them. Faint silhouettes appeared in the parking lot. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as the lights continued to flicker, the shadows moved, jerky, inhuman, pacing across the cracked asphalt. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, their forms dark and featureless, too tall and too thin to be people. They moved slowly, almost aimlessly, weaving between the scattered cars. Their legs didn't bend as they walked, their limbs stiff and unnatural. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles white. My instincts screamed at me to do something, turn on more lights, grab my phone, anything. But the rules hammered in my head like a drum beat. Avoid the parking lot. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the lobby. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure. A low, throbbing pulse that made my teeth ache and my chest tighten. The shadows in the parking lot seemed to respond, their movements becoming more erratic, faster. One of them stopped suddenly. It turned, or at least it seemed to turn, its faceless head toward the lobby. I froze, unable to breathe as the shadowy figure stood there, staring at the building. It didn't move for what felt like an eternity, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it stepped closer. I pressed myself back into the chair, my pulse racing. It was still outside, the blinds still closed, but I felt it watching me. The hum grew louder. The other shadows began to follow, their stiff, jerky strides carrying them toward the lobby. Each step sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over me. The clock read 2:45 a.m., 15 minutes. I closed my eyes, gripping the list like a rosary, whispering the rules under my breath like a prayer. If I just followed them, I'd make it. The hum outside grew so loud it felt like it was inside my skull, rattling my thoughts. The shadows reached the edge of the parking lot, hovering just outside the pool of light from the lobby windows. And then, mercifully, they stopped. The hum faded, the light steadied, and the parking lot fell back into silence. I opened my eyes, blinking against the sudden stillness. My breathing was shallow, my chest aching from holding my breath. I glanced at the clock, 2:50 a.m. 10 more minutes, but I knew better than to hope the worst was over. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat frozen in the chair, every muscle tense, my eyes locked on the clock. 10 minutes to go, 10 agonizing eternal minutes. I could still feel the hum, faint now, lingering in my chest like the echo of a scream. The parking lot outside was quiet, but the memory of those pacing shadows clung to me, a weight I couldn't shake. The phone on the desk rang. The jarring sound nearly sent me tumbling out of my chair. My hand shot out instinctively, but I stopped short of picking it up. The rules. Do not answer unless it's room 6. My eyes darted to the small screen on the phone base. The glowing red numbers confirmed it, room 6. I stared at the receiver, my hand trembling as it hovered over it. Every instinct screamed at me to let it ring. But the rules. The list was crumpled in my lap, its shaky black letters almost mocking me now. I had broken too many already. This one, I couldn't ignore. With a deep breath, I snatched up the phone and pressed it to my ear. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. At first, there was nothing but static, the same faint crackling I'd heard when room 7 called. I almost hung up, thinking it was a mistake, when a calm, steady voice broke through. "It's almost over," the voice said, soft and eerily reassuring. "Just don't look outside." My blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The line clicked and the call ended. I stared at the receiver in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted to the clock, 2:55 a.m. 5 more minutes. The hum outside started again, faint but rising steadily, growing louder with each passing second. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the phone in one hand and the list in the other. "Just don't look outside," the voice had said. But every fiber of my being wanted to know what was happening. The blinds rattled, and I flinched, my grip tightening on the list. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself. "Follow the rules, it's almost over." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my very bones. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting chaotic shadows across the lobby. And then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across the outside of the door. It wasn't a knock this time. It was deliberate, slow, and unrelenting. The clock read 2:59 a.m., 1 minute to go. I pressed myself back into the chair, forcing my eyes to stay shut, repeating the rules over and over in my head like a mantra. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Look," it said, the voice guttural and distorted like it was crawling inside my ears. "Just look." I clenched my teeth, my nails digging into the crumpled list. The clock ticked over to 3 a.m. The hum vanished. The rattling stopped. The lobby fell into a dead, oppressive silence. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move. Minutes passed, and the stillness began to feel almost normal again. When I finally opened my eyes, the clock read 3:05 a.m. The lobby was calm, the fluorescent light steady. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling. I had mostly followed the rules, and I had made it. But as I sat there in the eerie quiet of the lobby, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside wasn't gone. Not entirely, and it was only a matter of time before the next test came. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. My fingers were still curled around the crumpled list of rules, now damp from the sweat of my trembling hands. The clock read 3:10 a.m., and the hum from the parking lot was gone, leaving behind a vacuum of sound that felt almost louder than the noise had been. I stared at the desk, willing myself to stay put. The voice on the phone, the rattling blinds, the scraping, it was over. I had made it. Or so I thought. The loud bang on the glass startled me. My head jerked up instinctively, and before I could stop myself, my eyes darted toward the lobby window. The blinds were ripped open, and standing there, framed by the window, was the figure. It was tall and featureless, its form a dark, shifting mass that almost seemed to blend with the night behind it. Where a face should have been, there was nothing, just a smooth, blank surface that seemed to absorb the flickering light from the parking lot. its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. I couldn't move. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure pressed forward, leaning with all of its weight against the glass. The surface of its skin began to ripple, warping like liquid as it pushed harder against the pane. The glass groaned, the sounds sharp and unnatural, as if the motel itself were protesting the figure's presence. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, and ducked under the desk. The cold linoleum floor pressed against my palms as I crouched there, clutching the list to my chest like a lifeline. The rules. The rules were all that mattered now. I squeezed my eyes shut and began reciting them under my breath, each word a desperate prayer. Do not check in guests after midnight. Keep the blinds closed. Don't leave the desk. The groaning glass turned to a wet scraping sound like flesh dragging over metal. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Don't look, don't listen, don't let them in, I whispered, the words tumbling from my lips like a mantra. The sound grew louder, closer. I clamped my hands over my ears, curling into myself as tightly as I could. And then, silence. No scraping, no groaning, just the faint hum of the vending machine, steady and unchanging. I stayed frozen, too afraid to move, until a flicker of light caught my eye. The security monitor on the desk buzzed faintly, its grainy screen cycling through the parking lot cameras. I crawled up slowly, my legs shaky, and peeked over the edge of the desk. The parking lot was empty. No figures, no shadows, just the same cracked asphalt and flickering lamps I'd been staring at all night. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I cycled through the feeds. Everything was still, calm, except for one thing. Room 7's door was swinging open. The camera showed it clearly, the heavy wooden door swaying gently back and forth as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. The room beyond was dark, its interior hidden in shadow. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles ached. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was rooted to the spot. The door stopped swinging, settling halfway open, and then it began to creak, slowly, as if something or someone was pushing it wider. I flipped the camera feed back to the parking lot, desperate for anything else to focus on, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it might be over, and then it was. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the horizon, pale and weak, but to me, they felt like a lifeline. The oppressive silence that had clung to the motel all night began to ease, replaced by the faint hum of distant cars on the interstate and the soft chirping of early morning birds. I stayed behind the desk, still clutching the crumpled list of rules, now damp from the sweat of my trembling hands. My body felt like it had aged decades in just one night. Every muscle ached, and my hands shook as I set the paper down. The security monitors flickered, their feeds now showing nothing more than an empty parking lot in the still, quiet hallways of the motel. Room 7's door had stopped swinging at some point, now firmly shut, as if nothing had ever happened. The front door jangled as it swung open, and I jumped, my heart still not ready for sudden sounds. It was Mr. Carver, carrying a styrofoam cup of coffee and looking far too relaxed for someone walking into this place. "Morning," he said, giving me a casual nod as he walked behind the desk. I stared at him, my mouth dry. "Mr. Carver, what the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He raised an eyebrow. "What was what?" "The night," I blurted. "The phone calls, the figures outside, the door to room 7 swinging open, everything. What the hell is going on here?" I leaned forward, pointing at the security monitor, where the image of room 7's door still lingered in my mind. "The guest in there, the one who called. What's their deal?" Mr. Carver's frown deepened. "Room 7's been empty for years," he said slowly. "No one stayed there since, well, you know." I didn't know. "What do you mean?" "Someone called me from that room. I heard them. They said," Mr. Carver interrupted, his voice low. "They said, don't let them in, didn't they?" I froze. "How do you know that?" I whispered, my stomach twisting. He sighed, setting his coffee down on the counter and fixing me with a heavy look. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than the last guy," he said, his tone almost regretful. "You've got potential, kid, but in good conscience, I can't let you keep working here." "What? Why not?" I asked, my voice breaking. "You broke the rules," he said simply, tapping the edge of the desk with his knuckles. "And now, they know it. You wouldn't make it through another night." I opened my mouth to argue, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. "Do yourself a favor," he said, grabbing his coffee and heading for the back office. "Hand in your keys and leave. The sooner the better." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing there, pale and shaking. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag, shoved the crumpled list into my pocket, and tossed the motel keys onto the counter. As I stepped outside into the early morning light, the air felt lighter, freer. But as I walked to my car, I glanced back at the motel. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move behind one of the lobby windows. I didn't wait to find out if it was real. I started my car and drove away, vowing never to return. Some places are better left behind, their secrets buried in the dark where they belong. And that motel, it's one of them.